Hey viewers, my name's Cara. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about privilege. This is a big buzzword lately, especially after the election and all of these things are coming up in the media and other things are not coming up in the media, which is equally as disappointing. And something that has been coming up a lot for a lot of people, obviously, is privilege. Trying to make this as concise as possible and not go into all of the different avenues that I could take talking about this subject. One of the main things that has been coming up over and over for me is this idea that a lot of our privilege is invisible. There are some minority statuses that people are a part of that are not able to be seen immediately and physically. So a lot of the times we may benefit from privileges that we don't feel we have because of how we're perceived by other people. And then there's also a bunch of things that have come up that, we don't even think about as privilege because they're privileges and because they're things that are so ingrained into us that if you don't have them, you're aware of it, but when you do, you might not necessarily think about it. I think this is a huge thing that can be something that helps people start to not necessarily relate to other people, because I think merely knowing about an issue doesn't mean that you're going to be able to relate to it if you haven't experienced it, but to be able to start to see a bit of why different people are so affected by these things in different ways, and to get out of your head and remember that it's not all about the way that you see things. And yes, you have your own problems, I have my own problems, everyone has their own problems, and those things that are problematic in your life are problems, and I don't think we should diminish them. Also remembering that just because there are problems that you haven't experienced doesn't mean that they don't exist. So one really cool thing that I saw a year or so ago, I want to say, on YouTube, maybe it was within this past year, during 2016, was a privilege walk activity that they actually did with a group of people on BuzzFeed. So I will put a link to that. They called the video "What is Privilege?" It was by BuzzFeed Yellow, and they read a series of 35 statements of, if this applies to you, take a step forward if it represents a privilege. If this applies to you, take a step backward if it represents a lack of a privilege, and just kind of seeing where you end up. There are different versions of this activity online. Different ones have different statements, so there are different privileges being highlighted. I did one, I followed the one in the BuzzFeed video, and also I found one that is like a group activity exercise that was in a PDF file that I found online that only had 12 or 13 statements, but it included some different things that were more of the things that I didn't even think about when we're thinking about privilege. So if you want to do that, you can look up those different activities. It's called the privilege walk exercise because it's usually done by standing on a line and you have 10 lines in front of you and 10 lines behind you and you take a step forward or backward. However, you can do this yourself by drawing lines on a sheet of paper. And this was the two different positions that I ended up in based on which activity I was following. The one that was only 12 or 13 statements and had different types of statements, I ended up at a position of +3 out of 10. And on the BuzzFeed video version that had 35 statements and was about many different things, these were things that had more to do with gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, safety, education, things like that, I ended up at a final position of -1 out of +10 or -10. But I kept going, backward and forward and kind of fluctuating right around that center point until the end one. This one up here, I had a lot fluctuating in the +1 and 2 category, and then shot up a few when it got to things that I hadn't been thinking about before, such as if you were born in the United States, if you're a US citizen, and if English was your first language. And then coming back down for a couple of things, so I ended up at a +3. So it's going to be different depending on the types of things you're talking about, but I think that looking at these statements and going through these things and thinking about them really helps to think about different things that you might not think of as privilege. When we think of privilege, I think, and this is what I've been thinking, so I think that other people may think, at least other people similar to my situation, we tend to talk about things like gender, race, sexual orientation, gender expression, physical ability versus disability, mental ability versus disability, your financial well-being, whether your relationship style is considered mainstream, whether your religion is considered mainstream, stuff like that. So like those big tick marks of what is your demographic are the things that we often think of as being privileged or not. And that's where I start thinking about the ways that I am a member of some minority groups that other people don't know I'm a part of if you just look at me. So unless I tell you, you tend to assume the minority status that I look like I have. So I end up benefiting from a lot more privilege than I necessarily feel like I have based on my minority statuses. But then there are all these other things that we don't think about, right? Like having English as my first language. That's absolutely a privilege. Having makeup and clothing in the stores be easy to find for my skin tone. Access to education. The BuzzFeed video, one of the statements is, if there were 50 or more books in your household growing up, take a step forward. That is a privilege. Granted, a lot of mine tended to be about crystals and things like that, but I had a wealth of information about things and I had access to education. Neither of the activities that I looked at talked about growing up with one versus two parents or no parents but being raised by someone else. Neither of them talked about being adopted, growing up in the adoption system. There was one that talked about if you or your family has gone through a divorce, but there are lots of other places that we could go through and realize that we have more or less privilege. So that was my main takeaway from today, was looking at all the things that I don't even think of as privilege, like having makeup that matches my skin tone and stuff like that. So there's a lot of talk post-election about how a lot of people who do have minority statuses still, apparently to the rest of people, voted against who they are or voted against their minority statuses because to them, another one of their identities was more salient or more important, right? So this is where a lot of people have been talking about intersectionality and the crossover between different identities, so you have, generally speaking, males in our society have more privilege than females. Generally speaking, white people have more privilege than people of color. But then there's the intersectionality, right, of a white man versus a black man who has more privilege, or a black man versus a white woman who has more privilege. One has the gender privilege, but one has the racial privilege. Does that mean they're equal? No, they're still very different experiences and very different things. But it depends on which identity is more salient. If people are talking more about an issue where they feel that the gender stereotypes are more applicable, then the man might receive preferential treatment, or he might be privileged in that situation because it's a male versus female situation, even if she's white and they are a person of color. If religion is salient, then it might make a difference whether she's pagan and he's Hindu. If race is the salient identity and thing going on in the situation, then that takes precedence. It's sort of hard to explain without giving specific concrete examples, but I think you know what I'm getting at there. So I have certain privileges, right? I actually have a lot of privilege, even though it doesn't feel like I have some privileges, because the things that are more salient to me tend to be things that are my minority statuses, like my identity as a woman, as a pagan, and as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So the things that I really identify with more readily are those minority statuses. So I feel like I identify more with that. But people looking at me don't see these things, and to them it might be more important what my race is. So even though my race isn't as important to me as my gender, religion, and sexuality, I still definitely benefit from that racial privilege, even when it's not the thing that I'm thinking of, because other people will look at me and be thinking of that if that's what's important to them, or if that's what's salient to the situation at hand. I would receive more privilege than someone else. Even if I view them as more privileged, I receive it because of how people are seeing the whole situation because of my race. And things like my religion and my sexuality are not inherently visible by just looking at me. I might wear a gay pride bracelet and I might be wearing a pentacle, but people don't necessarily always notice that. For sure, people always assume I'm straight until I tell them that I'm not. People assume Christianity in this country unless you look like you're not Christian, whatever that looks like. But if they don't notice that I'm wearing a specific amount of jewelry or whatever, specific type of symbol, people constantly assume that I'm Catholic or Christian. Especially if they know I'm Italian and where I live, they assume I'm Catholic because most of the Italians around here are. Then especially if they find out that I'm also Irish, or if they see me wearing a Claddagh ring, anything like that. There are lots of ways that people can assume your privilege, and you benefit from that even if it's not your identity. And that's important to remember. I read an article recently that was published on Everyday Feminism, so it came to me through Everyday Feminism. I shared it on my Twitter feed. If you go back and look, it'll be there. I will find it and I'll link it in the description here so you can read it, because I'm going to mention something that was mentioned in it. I read an article from someone who was talking about bisexuality and the idea that, as a woman, when I'm hanging out with one of my female friends, everybody thinks, oh, we're just friends, but then as soon as we start holding hands, the entire vibe of the way people are interacting with us changes, because now it starts to look like there might be a different status going on. And then, like, as they were pointing out in the article, they said something like, as soon as I let go of my girlfriend's hand, in the eyes of the world, I became straight again. And there's this kind of idea and assumption that unless we're physically doing something or looking a certain way or wearing a certain thing that broadcasts that minority status, we immediately go back to being assumed to be the majority status. And I absolutely relate to that, because I have been out in public places with female friends and observed the way that people interact or observe us, which tends to be nothing at all when we're not doing anything. But if we decide to start holding hands or sitting really close or cuddling, all of a sudden people start to look. The way that people talk to us is different, and the way that people interact is different. But then as soon as we disengage from that, it just goes back to normal, like assumption. There are a lot of really awesome articles like that out there, written by people of all different sorts of minority statuses, all different types of privilege and lack thereof, intersectionality. I've been reading a lot about that kind of stuff, so you'll see a lot of it that has been shared on my Twitter feed, and you'll find a lot more of it through websites like Everyday Feminism. I definitely have some feelings about the demographics of the way that the election votes went, and the idea that for some people race was more salient than their gender, or, you know, their personal views, and the way that certain things would affect people who already have privilege in certain areas. We're just looking out for some of the privilege that they still have, but ignoring the things that could help people who are underprivileged, but that would not negatively affect those with privilege. And just kind of this idea that we're not looking out for each other, and we're not seeing even what the problems are. There's been so much evidence of that recently. People just don't understand what there is to be upset about. There's a lot wrapped up in this, and I think that a good place to start is trying to be aware of our privilege and how much of it we have, how many different types of it we have, how the intersectionality plays out, and how much it's affected by the way people see us, even if it's not the way we identify. One of the things that, honestly, it's like a weird thing, but one of the things that my girlfriend and I, who are both white females, who are somewhere on the LGBTQ plus community spectrum, we feel like one of the most important things we can do is be more obvious about the minority statuses that we have, because not only kind of in solidarity with people, because so many people are afraid of everyone. You're afraid of everyone if you don't trust them, because you don't know who believes that you shouldn't have the rights that you should have. So not just in solidarity of like, I'm one of you too, we can be allies, but just wanting to challenge people to think differently. I've gotten into a lot of conversations recently with people, with them just saying things that are really bigoted and hateful, assuming that everyone present agrees with them because they look around and we all look the same. But then, you know, one of us says, actually, I'm not that. Actually, I'm this. And, you know, this is my experience. And then people are kind of flabbergasted. You should really try to not assume things like that. You should always try not to assume things about people. This is just more of that same thing that we all know, right? And that we, I'm preaching to the choir, try to do. But yeah, we just feel like, even though it probably won't actually help much, and in some situations it could be extremely dangerous to do so, we've been talking, and we just feel like one of the only things that we can even do, that we know how to do, other than talk to people who we know, is to just be visible, and be visible as, you know, we are some of these people who are anxious and afraid, and who maybe you don't think of as belonging to a different group, but we actually do. And yes, we have things in common, and we are a lot alike as well. There are areas that we are not alike that we can learn from each other. And, you know, don't assume things based on who you think you know. And the fact that, you know, I just mentioned in some situations it could be really dangerous for us, the fact that these are things that we can kind of hide because they're not immediately visible is in itself a privilege. The fact that if I choose to walk into a place where I know that there are a lot of homophobic people, for example, and I don't wear anything that would signify that I am in any way queer, that is a privilege, to be able to hide and blend in that environment. The fact that I know that a lot of people don't pay attention to the small pentacle that I wear or the ornamental one that I wear, most people don't see what it is, I can just bank on that not being observed and choose to keep my mouth shut about that. The fact that I can hide those things if I want to remain in a safe situation is a privilege. My high school education and my college education are privileges. Even living in the Northern Hemisphere is a privilege in a lot of ways because so many people who live in the Northern Hemisphere assume that that's the way the seasons work, that that's the way the calendar works. You know, I think of this because of in the pagan community, in the Northern Hemisphere, we tend to talk about like, okay, so the winter solstice is coming up, so we'll say things like happy winter solstice, forgetting that for half the world, it's summer. I didn't know for a long time, because no one had told me and I never thought about it, that the moon phases look different in the Southern Hemisphere. So the fact that we most often see the triple moon symbol represented in the way that it looks in the Northern Hemisphere is a privilege. If you live in a snowy winter climate where you can have a white Christmas, the fact that so much Christmas music and movies and stories and just the whole aesthetic of it, the fact that it's a very wintry, snowy vibe, and being in that climate is a privilege. Because everyone, for some reason, thinks that, like, it's not Christmas without snow, even though tons of places don't have snow on Christmas, or ever, for that matter. And it definitely didn't exist in the original location where everything originated. Sorry, that's just kind of on my mind right now because I'm working on a Christmas show for my theater and it did just start snowing. And that's something that I think about every year when this time of year comes up. It's just like, it's not all like that everywhere, guys. Privilege is a lot of those majority versus minority status situations for sure. And I both have privilege and lack privilege in those ways, but there are also a lot of places and things and situations that we might not even be thinking about where we have a lot of privilege that we need to recognize, and also places where we may not be, that we can open up a conversation with other people or, you know, whatever. And you're not responsible for representing your entire group of whatever it may be. You're not. If you choose not to engage in stuff some of the time or all the time, it's not totally up to you. If, like me, you feel like that is one of the things that you can be doing to help make the world a better place, then that is cool, but there are definitely times when I can't do that, and that's why I haven't been making videos for the past couple of weeks, and I'm just now getting it all out kind of at once. So I definitely have a lot of feelings. I know everyone has a lot of feelings. I know a lot of people have very few feelings, and that gives me feelings. There's definitely still a lot that I can't go into, a lot that I still only discuss with very close, trusted people, that I need to just, you know, work out some stuff. But there's a lot that I'm reading, there's a lot that I'm listening to from other people, and that's important, no matter who you are. I can't tell you to do it, but I can tell you that it would be helpful to everyone, and not doing it and choosing not to be informed about other people's struggles and not caring, or some people will claim up and down that they do care and that they care really deeply, but yet they don't do any work toward hearing people out or like learning anything about issues that don't directly affect them. That is adding to a lot of the problems. I think that's about as much as I'm qualified to say about it at the moment. There is another video somewhat related to this that I want to record sometime in the future, just tangentially related, but a little more in depth on another point. But until then, I've got some other videos that need to be posted. I'll try to stick some fun ones in between here so it's not just all this like, okay, deep work, life work, decreasing world suck work, nerd fighters, what up? So until the next time I see you, whatever that may be, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.